Outside, the wind screamed across the empty highway and rattled the diner windows in their frames. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed over the last pot of beef stew. Sophie looked at the 15 men standing by the door, their black coats dripping snow onto the floor. "Every bowl," she whispered. "Give it to them." Mr. Harris caught her wrist. "Sophie, you haven't eaten since dawn." She eased her hand free. "They re-hungrier." The men outside were the kind people cross streets to avoid. No one in Maple Creek could have known that one hot meal on a frozen Tuesday night would drag a quiet waitress into the path of a mafia boss. A buried crime. And the truth that had destroyed her father. The storm began at 4. It was not soft, pretty snow. It came sideways off Lake Erie in hard white sheets, mean enough to blind anyone caught in it. By 5, the interstate was a frozen line of stalled cars. By 7, Sophie was alone at the Maple Creek Cafe with 68-year-old Mr. Harris, whose bad hip throbbed whenever the weather turned cruel. Everyone else had gone home or called out. He stood near the window with both hands around a mug that had already gone cold. "Nobody's coming out tonight," he said. Sophie kept filling napkin holders because work gave her hands something to do. Somebody might. Mr. Harris had owned that diner not long enough to know when a girl was working because she needed the money and when she was working because going home would feel worse. Sophie needed the extra hours. Her mother's medicine was late again, and the hospital had already called twice about payment. At 26, she had learned how fast a family could fall when there was nobody underneath to catch it. Still, she had not grown hard. Her father used to say bitterness charged interest, and it always collected from the wrong person. Sophie had chosen a harder thing. She kept showing up. So she wiped the counter, checked the coffee, and listened to the wind slap against the walls. At 8:47, the bell over the door rang. The first man stepped in. Then another. Then another. Until the diner seemed too small for the silence they brought with them. 15 men in black coats. No laughter. No loud voices. Just the heavy quiet of people who were used to being feared. Sophie froze with the coffee pot in her hand. Behind her, Mr. Harris counted under his breath. 15. The last man through the door closed it gently. And somehow that made him more frightening. He was broad-shouldered, sharply dressed, and built like someone who expected rooms to make space for him. Dark hair slicked back, graying beard trimmed close, eyes cold enough to measure every corner before anyone noticed. The others waited for him before moving. Sophie understood that at once. He was not the loudest man in the room. He did not need to be. His gaze moved over the exits, the windows, Mr. Harris, then stopped on her. She held still. "We need to eat," he said. "Sit anywhere." Sophie replied, "I'll bring coffee." A man with tattoos up his neck muttered, "She's not scared." The leader glanced once, and the man shut his mouth. The men took 4 tables and 2 booths without scraping a chair, moving with the kind of discipline that made the room feel even smaller. Sophie poured black coffee first. Steam curled around bruised knuckles, cracked skin, and hands that had clearly known more than honest work. One man had a fresh cut under his jaw. Another hit a limp badly. As she took in the room, panic rose quietly in her chest. The diner was nearly broke. The pantry shelves were thin. There was bread, a little pie, and 1 pot of stew on the stove. 1 pot meant for 2 hungry people after closing. Sophie had made that stew at noon from Mr. Harris' last beef shank and a few tired vegetables. It was thick, dark and warm enough to make the place feel less defeated, but it would not stretch forever. In the kitchen, Mr. Harris stared into the pot like he could shame it into becoming more. "Sophie, we don't know who they are," he whispered. "No," she said, "but we know they recold, and dangerous." She looked through the pass-through window at the silent men waiting in the dining room. Hungry people get more dangerous when you tell them no. Then she picked up the bowls. "I'll handle it." Sophie stepped back out and kept her voice steady. "I have beef stew, warm bread, and cherry pie. That's everything. I can take separate orders tonight. If that works. I'll bring it out family style." The tattooed man leaned back as if to object. The leader stopped him without a word. That works, he said, later. Sophie would learn his name was Vincent Moretti. That night, he was just the man whose eyes missed nothing. She served them evenly, stretching every bowl, cutting the bread thinner than usual, refilling coffee before anyone asked. She did not smile too much. She did not tremble. She simply did the work. When she set down the last basket of bread, Vincent caught her wrist not hard, just enough to stop her. The room went still. Sophie looked at his hand until he let go. You re not eating. He said, I'm working. You made the stew. That's how kitchens work. A short laugh slipped out of him before he could stop it. And for half a second, the hard lines of his face softened. By 10, the wind had eased, and word came that the interstate was clearing. The men stood and pulled on their coats. Sophie went to the register, adding the bill twice because her hands had started to shake. Vincent walked to the counter. What do we owe you? Sophie told him the total. He laid down more cash than the meal was worth. Far more, and covered it with 2 fingers when she tried to push some back. For the inconvenience. You were hungry, she said. That's not an inconvenience. Something flickered across his face. Quick and private. From the door, Tommy called. We need to move. Vincent. The name hit Mr. Harris like a slap. When the men left, the diner felt suddenly too bright and too empty. Mr. Harris locked the door with shaking hands. Sophie, he said. Do you know who you just fed? That was Vincent Moretti. Mr. Harris said the name like it might bring trouble back through the door. Sophie stacked bowls in the sink and kept her face calm. Everyone in Western New York knew the Moretti name. It traveled ahead of the man, carried by whispers, police reports, and stories people lowered their voices to tell. I know who he is, she said. But knowing did not change what had happened. 15 men had come in cold and hungry. She had food. Later in her dark kitchen, Sophie ate peanut butter from a spoon over the sink and tried not to think about the way Vincent had looked at her when she refused to call him a burden. The next morning, the town woke to something it would talk about for years. Sophie arrived before sunrise, half asleep and still sore from the night before, when Rosa called her to the front window. The diner had 23 painted parking spaces. None of them were visible. Black sedans and heavy SUVs stretched along the road in both directions, engines idling in the cold mist. More kept rolling in, slow and silent, until the line vanished beyond the bend. 2 armored transports sat near the shoulder. The Maple Creek Cafe looked less like a diner than the center of a siege. Rosa whispered that they should call the police. Mr. Harris had gone pale. Sophie untied her apron, smoothed it flat, and told him to start more coffee. When she stepped onto the porch, the cold hit her hard enough to steal her breath. Vincent Moretti stood at the bottom of the steps in a heavy wool coat. His men spread behind him like a storm waiting for permission. Sophie looked past him at the endless cars. Last night I said you were an inconvenient, she told him. This is inconvenient. His mouth almost curved. I owe you breakfast, he said. Your whole town. My town has about 400 people, Sophie said. Then we wait. Vincent answered. The way he said it made clear he meant every word. Sophie studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Coffee's hot, behind him. More than 100 car doors closed almost together, the sound rolling across the road like distant thunder. By 9:15, the diner had turned into controlled chaos. Rosa, Diane, and Mr. Harris moved between the grill, counter and booths without wasting a step. Pancakes hissed on the griddle. Coffee poured nonstop. Every time Sophie looked up, another feared man was waiting quietly for a plate like a child at Sunday breakfast. What unsettled Sophie most was not their size or their silence. It was their manners. They said please. They said thank you. They moved carefully around Rosa with her tray. Tommy, the tattooed man from the night before, sat at the counter under the yellow lights and worked through a stack of blueberry pancakes with almost solemn respect. When Sophie refilled his coffee, he smiled in a way that made him look younger. Best pancakes since my grandmother died. He's in the corner booth. Vincent sat where he could see every door and window. He watched the room. Not as a guest, but as a man guarding something he had not yet admitted mattered. Vincent claimed the corner booth simply by sitting there. 2 bodyguards stayed close enough to be useful, and far enough to pretend he was alone. His phone lay beside his cup. Lighting up with messages he answered in short, cold taps. When Sophie came with the coffee pot, he nodded to the seat across from him. Sit, I am working. You've been working for 4 hours. So has everyone else. His eyes stayed on hers until the argument felt pointless. Sophie slid into the booth. Vincent turned his phone face down. Sophie Bennett. He said, it was not a question. You looked me up. This morning. And you came back anyway. Sophie held his gaze. Last night. I served you before I knew. Today I served you after I knew. Draw your own conclusion. Vincent went still. Most people rushed to fill silence around him. Sophie did not. Last night. He said you were hungry. She did not deny it. The roads were closed. I had food. You had hunger. That's the whole story. My men aren't used to being treated like travelers. That's what you were. He looked toward the packed room, where Tommy was laughing softly with Diane over burnt toast. For the first time, Vincent seemed unsure what to do with what he had been given. He lifted his cup, then set it down again. The cash was too much. Sophie said. It was appropriate. It was twice the bill. The bill was for food. The rest was for what you refused to make me feel. Sophie thought of her mother's unpaid prescriptions. Of the rent Mr. Harris could barely cover. Of pride dressed up as survival. You don't owe me anything. Vincent leaned back, eyes narrowing toward the street. That S where you re-wrong. By 11. Half the town was pretending not to stare through the windows. By noon, even the deputy had given up and ordered coffee. The deputy stood near the door, mug in hand, wearing the weary face of a man who knew this was beyond his badge. Mrs. Patterson from the library ate cherry pie slowly, collecting every detail for later. The Nguyen family sent their teenage son over with a plate of spring rolls. And one of Vincent's older men asked for the recipe, as if they were neighbors at a church supper. Sophie kept moving, but her fear loosened a little. For hours she had braced for threats. Broken glass. A wrong word. A wrong look. Instead, the diner filled with coffee steam, clattering forks, and men warming their hands around chipped mugs. At noon, Vincent stood and pulled on his coat. The room shifted with him. Sophie was behind the counter, coffee pot heavy in her hand. When he came close enough to lower his voice, the diner. What does Harris pay in rent? Her shoulders tightened. That is not your concern. Wendell Briggs owns the building. I know who owns it. Vincent's eyes stayed cool. Then you know he's bleeding this place dry. Sophie set the pot down with a sharp clink. This diner is yours to fix. You served me your last pot of food and went home hungry. He said, don't stand there and tell me this place is fine. Only 2 of his men remained. But the silence felt like the whole diner had leaned in. Sophie felt heat climb her neck. How do you know I went home hungry? Tommy asked if you were eating. You said you were working. Vincent's voice was quiet, almost gentle. People who are eating don't answer like that. She stared at him, angry because he was right and angrier because he had noticed. You watch everything. I have to. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Keller is the only man in this county who knows how to take a building from people too tired to fight. Sophie looked up sharply. Who is Keller? Vincent did not answer. He walked out. That name stayed with Sophie longer than the line of black cars. Keller, she asked Mr. Harris after closing. But he only went quiet and told her not to borrow trouble. 3 anxious days passed. Then on Thursday morning, Briggs called Mr. Harris and suddenly reduced the lease renewal by 40%. Mr. Harris cried into the phone. Sophie stood in her kitchen, staring at the frost on the window, and knew Vincent had done something. On Friday, he came back alone, his dark sedan parked beneath a flat gray sky. No convoy. No bodyguards in sight. Just Vincent Moretti walking into the diner like a man expecting a fight. Sophie slid coffee onto his table without sitting. Wendell Briggs called. Did he don't play polite with me? She sat across from him. Jaw tight. I am grateful. Mr. Harris slept last night for the first time in weeks. But I do like invisible debts. Vincent, I don't like favors with shadows attached. Vincent turned the cup slowly between his hands. There's no shadow. There's always a shadow with men like you. The words came out sharper than she intended. He accepted them without flinching. That made her more uneasy. His silence felt less like guilt than restraint. Like he was holding back a truth he knew would change the room. Last Tuesday, Vincent said. We had been on the road for 11 hours. There was a problem in Rochester. The weather trapped us. My men were cold, angry, and close to doing something stupid. He met her eyes. We walked into your diner, and you asked if we wanted coffee. Sophie said nothing. Do you know how long it's been since someone did something for me without weighing the cost? His voice had roughened. I came back because I couldn't forget what it felt like to be treated like a human being. Sophie wanted to dismiss it. She had heard men rap neat and pretty words before, but Vincent's face held no performance. She had learned young to listen for the hook inside a gift. Looking at him now, she could not find it. That is either very honest, she said, or very practiced. I'm practiced at many things. Vincent answered. Not this. The bluntness caught her off guard. Fine, she said. I'll believe you for now. A faint smile touched at his mouth. For now he stayed 2 hours and asked for nothing. But Sophie felt him watching the diner with a strange attention. Mr. Harris limp. Rose's tired back. The cracked window seal. The rent notice half hidden near the register. Vincent noticed weakness the way other men noticed weather. When old Mr. Patterson struggled with a sugar packet, Sophie stepped over and opened it before he had to ask. It was small. Automatic. Barely worth mentioning. Vincent watched as if it were not small at all. Later, when the lunch rush thickened, he stood and buttoned his coat. Same time tomorrow, he said. It sounded less like a command than a question he had forgotten how to ask. After he left, Tommy slid into the counter seat Vincent had passed. He came alone today, Tommy said quietly. That never happens. Sophie looked through the window at Vincent's taillights fading into gray. For the first time, she wondered what kind of man needed guards even from silence. Vincent kept returning. The next morning, the morning after that, by the 4th week. Mr. Harris brewed fresh dark roast at 9:55 without being asked. And Sophie stopped, pretending the corner booth was just another table. Their conversations were not easy. Vincent asked questions that stepped around politeness and went straight to the locked places. Sophie told him about her father, Daniel Bennett, and the hardware shop he had lost before grief took the rest of him. Vincent listened without reaching for soft words. People think losing someone happens once, Sophie said. It does tea. You lose them in pieces. Then you live around the holes. You fight for people, Vincent said one morning, his fingers tight around his mug. Sophie gave a tired laugh. Most people decide fighting is too much trouble. His gaze darkened. Most people haven't watched a family disappear one bill at a time. Then he told her about his own father, a man he had loved and feared, a man who left him a criminal empire wrapped in blood and favors. Vincent had spent 20 years trying to clean parts of it, without pretending the stain was gone. Sophie did not offer forgiveness. Understanding is absolution, she said. You can know why someone broke and still hold him accountable. Vincent looked at her then, as if she had named something he had never dared to say. The moment settled between them, quiet and dangerous in its own way. Sophie reached for the coffee pot, because movement was safer than looking at him too long. Outside, winter pressed against the glass. Inside, the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt like a door neither of them had opened yet. When March arrived, gray and stubborn, Sophie noticed the wind had softened on her walk to work. A small mercy. But she had learned to count those. Survival had made her careful. Vincent was making her careless in a different way. And she was not sure she liked how much she wanted to let it happen. For 3 weeks, Vincent was a steady shape in the corner booth. arriving on time, sometimes twice a day. Sophie found herself saving the better coffee for him, and then hating herself for noticing. She did not tell her mother. Beside the hospital bed, holding that thin, familiar hand, she talked about the weather, cherry pie, Mr. Harris hip, anything except the man with dangerous eyes who listened too closely. One evening, she found a folded blanket on her mother's chair, left by no one who would admit it. Vincent said only, "Hospitals are cold." That was why Sophie missed the car across the street. For 2 days, a black town car sat near the pharmacy, angled toward the diner. Rosa noticed first. Same car, Sophie asked. Same driver. Different plates. Sophie tried to shrug it off, but her stomach tightened. An hour later, the bell over the door rang. The man who entered was not one of Vincent's. He was polished, loud in his quietness, and smiling before anyone had given him a reason. Mid-50s, silver hair, winter tan, expensive suit. He sat at the counter without asking. "Coffee," he said. "Black." Then he looked around like he was already deciding where the walls would come down. Sophie poured the coffee, passing through. "Not exactly." His smile widened. Maple Creek Cafe. 31 years. Places like this collect memories, don't they? The way he said memories made them sound like clutter. Sophie set the pot back. "Can I get you food? I'm more interested in the building." Her hand stilled. "The building isn't tea on the menu. Everything is on a menu if the buyer has patience." He tapped one ringed finger against the counter. "Wendell Briggs and I have been discussing the lease." Sophie's blood went cold. He was not looking at a diner. He was looking at land. 9 years of waitressing had taught Sophie how to lock her face. "I didn't catch your name." "Richard Keller." He offered it like a gift. "I develop neglected corridors. Bring life back to places that can survive on sentiment." Sophie knew a threat when it arrived wearing a good suit. "Mr. Harris handles business matters." Keller leaned closer. "Old men get sentimental. Young women tend to see reality faster." Sophie held his gaze. "Reality is coffee costs $2. Refill is free if you don't insult the staff." For the first time, Keller's smile thinned. He left a neat tip and a colder silence. Sophie waited until his car was gone before calling Mr. Harris. "Richard Keller was here," Sophie said. On the other end, Mr. Harris went silent too long. "He wants the building. He wants more than that," Mr. Harris answered, his voice thin. He told her Keller had spent 15 years moving through western New York, buying tired businesses from frightened owners, then flattening them into lifeless commercial blocks. Keller did not come with fire or guns. He came with inspectors, lawyers, sudden fees, and men who smiled while doors closed. By the end, people blamed themselves. Then Mr. Harris said the part that made Sophie grip the receiver harder. Keller and Briggs had worked together before. "When does the lease end?" she asked, though she knew. 8 weeks, Mr. Harris whispered. "Promise me you won't sign anything," he promised. When Vincent walked in at 11, Sophie was standing behind the counter with too much stillness in her face. He noticed before he reached the booth. What happened? She did not soften it. "Richard Keller came here." Vincent's face changed so quickly, most people would have missed it. Sophie did not. The air around him sharpened. "What did he say?" "Enough to prove you already knew," he was circling. Vincent's jaw tightened. "Sophie, do not protect me by keeping me ignorant." The diner seemed to shrink around them. Vincent sat slowly, but his eyes had gone flat and lethal. "Keller destroys people with paper, not bullets. A bad inspection here. A loan changed there. A buyer hiding behind another company. By the time he is done, the victim thanks him for taking what's left." "And you were going to tell me when?" Sophie asked. "When I knew how close he was." He sat at my counter and smiled at me. Vincent, his hands flattened against the table. "I can handle him." She heard what that meant and leaned forward. "No, I want records. Witnesses. Light, not fear." Measuring the distance between her rules and Keller's appetite, He won't stop because you ask cleanly. Then I won't ask. Sophie's voice was low. Give me 8 weeks. I dig, I talk to people. I find what he buried. And if he pushes, then he pushes in public. For the next 2 weeks, the diner lived 2 lives. Coffee poured. Plates clattered. Regulars pretended not to notice the car across the street. Keller's men came and went. Sometimes the sedan was there. Sometimes it disappeared for days. Sophie learned not to feel relief when shadows moved. It only meant they had found somewhere darker to stand. On a quiet Thursday morning, Vincent slid a plain manila envelope across the booth. You didn't get this from me. Sophie did not touch it at first. What is it? A door inside were 60 pages. Old leases. Bank letters. Inspection notes. Names that appeared again and again beside ruined businesses. That night, under the kitchen's lonely yellow light, Sophie read every page. By page 12, her hands were cold. Keller was not a developer. He was a method. He found people already tired, pressed one weak place after another, and waited until they sold for pennies while calling it their own failure. Page 43 stopped her breathing. Daniel Bennett. Her father's name sat in the middle of an account summary, like it belonged there. Like his life had been nothing more than a line item. 11 years earlier, his hardware store had collapsed after a called-in loan, a failed inspection, and a lease dispute no one could explain. He had died believing he had ruined his family. But the file told a different story. Changed loan terms. Bought off inspections. Pressure through a company tied to Keller. Sophie stared at the page until the words blurred. Her father had not failed. He had been hunted. Keller had worked near them for years without ever showing his face. The ruin had looked like bad luck because he had designed it to look that way. Sophie sat at the table long after midnight, feeling grief change shape inside her. It became colder, sharper, more useful. Her father had carried shame that never belonged to him. At 12:17, she dialed Vincent before she could stop herself. He answered on the second ring. Awake and clear. Page 43, she said. The silence that followed told her everything. You knew. Vincent's voice came back quiet. I knew enough. You left it for me to find. Because if I told you, you would have heard my anger before you heard the truth. Sophie closed her eyes. She hated that he was right. He destroyed my father. Vincent did not offer comfort. He gave her something harder. Space for the truth to stand. There's a federal prosecutor. He said Diana Reyes. She has been building a case for 2 years. Sophie gripped the phone. Then why is to Keller in prison? Because men like Keller make sure every victim thinks they failed alone. Sophie looked at her father's name again. Not anymore. Reyes needed someone willing to go on record. Vincent told her. Someone who could put a name, a face and a family to what Keller had done. Nothing to gain except the truth. He added. Sophie asked for the meeting before fear could talk her out of it. Vincent warned her Keller would strike back. He would use the lease. Inspectors. Rumors, anything clean enough to deny. Let him, Sophie said. My father spent 30 years fixing broken things for people who coulda pay him half the time. Keller doesn't get to bury him twice. Outside her window, March frost silvered the glass. Sophie stopped asking whether she was afraid. She asked what fear had the right to stop. Her father had fixed small broken things. Pipes, doors, rusty hinges, old locks that stuck in winter. He had never known how to fight men who broke lives with paperwork. Sophie did. Or she was going to learn. I'm not afraid of Keller, she told Vincent, though they both knew that was not entirely true. You should be. Then I'll be afraid and move anyway. After she hung up, she laid the 60 pages across the kitchen table and wrote names on a legal pad until dawn. Her anger was real. But anger alone could burn the wrong house down. Evidence could open the right door. 3 days later, Sophie sat across from Agent Diana Reyes in a dim Buffalo conference room that smelled of old coffee and rain-soaked wool. Reyes was 41, sharp-eyed, and calm in a way that made excuses feel useless. Vincent had stepped outside so Sophie could speak for herself. The folder lay between them, heavy with ordinary paper and ruined lives. Reyes had already read it. Now she watched Sophie, as if measuring whether grief had made her reckless or steady. Tell me about Bennett Hardware, Reyes said. Sophie began with her father's hands. Cracked knuckles. Oil under the nails. A wedding ring worn thin from work. She told Reyes about the loan that changed without warning. The inspection that failed, for reasons no one could explain. The supplier who suddenly cut credit. The lawyer who promised help, and then stopped returning calls. Each piece sounded small by itself. Together they had become a wall her father could not climb. It took 2 years for him to lose the store. Then his confidence. Then the strength to keep fighting. Reyes wrote in tiny, careful script. Your father never found Keller. Sophie shook her head. He knew something was wrong. He just never found the hand behind it. Reyes looked at the file. Your father's records may be the missing spine. What does going on record mean? Sophie asked. Reyes did not soften the answer. A sworn statement. Your name on a federal complaint. Keller's lawyers will dig through your life. They will hit your diner. Your lease. Your mother's medical debt. Anything they think can make you step back. Sophie looked at her hands. He already came to the diner. Reyes' pen stopped. Keller came personally. Sat at the counter. Ordered coffee. Mentioned the lease. Reyes set the pen down. The sound was small. But it changed the room. Then our timeline just collapsed. If Keller is moving on your location now, we don't have months. We may have weeks. Then we move faster, Sophie said. Reyes studied her, then slid a thinner folder across the table. There's something else. The page inside was simple enough for anyone to understand. Money leaving Keller's side. Money reaching Wendell Briggs. And the diner sitting in the middle. Sophie followed the lines until the truth pulled the breath from her lungs. Briggs was not a bystander. Not a scared landlord. A partner. He had profited before, and he was positioned to profit again. The lease reduction Vincent had forced was not mercy. It was bait. Sophie sat very still, because if she moved too quickly, she might break something. Briggs had lowered the rent only to buy time, while Keller finished arranging the sale. The building was already nearly gone. The renewal offer had never been real. Sophie drove home and sat in her dark car for 10 minutes, unable to face the quiet house. The hardest part was knowing she could not tell Vincent yet. If he learned Briggs had played them, his rage might move faster than Reyes could. Sophie had asked for light, not fear. Now she had to live by that choice. To break Keller's chain, Reyes needed one more witness. Not another chart. A person who had seen the machine from inside. The witness came from the past like a man climbing out of a grave. Gerald Fitch was 73 and looked older. His shoulders folded inward by 12 years of silence. He had kept books for Keller's companies before vanishing to the east side. Mr. Harris brought him to the diner on Friday and left him in the corner booth. Gerald's hand shook so badly the coffee trembled in the cup. Harris says you have the 60 pages, he whispered. Sophie sat across from him. I have what they show. Gerald looked at her with tired, frightened eyes. Then you know about Bennett Hardware. I want to know what they don't show. Gerald swallowed hard. Your father called the bank himself. He knew the loan terms had been changed. Sophie went still. He knew, he fought it. Gerald's voice cracked. He tried to get the original documents compared, but the originals were replaced with a falsified copy. By the time he found a lawyer willing to look, foreclosure was already moving. Sophie's hands tightened beneath the table. The lawyer. Gerald stared into his coffee. On Keller's retainer. Your father walked into a trap and never knew it. The diner noise faded around Sophie. For 11 years. She had believed her father gave up. He had not. He had been cornered. Gerald covered his face with one trembling hand. I should have said something then. Sophie wanted to hate him. For a second. She almost did. Then she saw the ruined shape of him, and understood that fear had been collecting payment from him too. Will you talk to Agent Reyes? Gerald looked out at the gray street. My wife is gone. My children live far away. Keller already took the part of my life I was trying to protect. He lifted the cup with both hands. I am still afraid. but I'm tired of letting that decide. That night, Gerald Fitch gave Reyes 4 hours of recorded testimony, and Keller's quiet empire finally began to crack. Gerald's statement changed everything. 2 more people agreed to stop whispering and say what they knew out loud. Reyes moved from waiting to action. Sophie could feel the case gathering speed beneath her feet. Keller felt it too. On Tuesday morning, she arrived at the diner and found a jagged crack climbing across the front window. No brick, no note. Just damage made to look random. She stood in the cold, staring at the glass until fear settled and hardened. Then she unlocked the door. The next day, a health inspector arrived without warning, clipboard ready before he even stepped into the kitchen. The inspector moved through the kitchen for 90 minutes, searching with the patience of a man who had been told what to find. He cited a grease trap issue Mr. Harris had cleared 2 months earlier. It was not dramatic, and that made it worse. Paperwork, fees delay, official language wrapped around a threat. Mr. Harris read the notice and went white. Sophie had already called Reyes. By Thursday, 3 regulars had stopped coming. Pete Hamill crossed the street when he saw her through the window. That hurt more than the cracked glass. Keller was not just attacking the diner. He was teaching the town to stay away. Sophie called Vincent from the hallway, her fingers tight around the receiver. He's moving. Vincent's answer came too quickly. I know, the words hit her like a slap. You know, silence. I had people watching. Watching and not telling me is deciding for me. He did not defend himself. That was the only reason she stayed on the line. You rewrite, he said. Sophie pressed her forehead against the cold wall. I need a partner. Vincent, not another man making choices in rooms I'm not allowed inside. His voice lowered. Then tell me what you need. For once, he sounded ready to obey. Sophie looked through the doorway at the empty stools. He's using fear that looks like bad luck. Glass, inspectors, empty seats. Next comes the lease, Vincent said. Then building violations. Then something no one can call random. His calm frightened her more than panic would have. Then we make him move in daylight, she said. I want the town to see what he's done. Not rumors. Names, dates. Families. People who thought they failed when someone was stealing the floor under them. Vincent went quiet. If you release the pattern, he'll accelerate. Good, across the diner. Mr. Harris taped the cracked window like a wound. You are using yourself as bait, Vincent said. I am using the truth. Even as she said it, Sophie knew the difference was thin enough to cut her. Reyes needed Keller to make a mistake. Sophie needed the town to stop looking away. Here's what I need from you, she said. Gerald Fitch and the others stay safe. No blood, no retaliation. No men disappearing into alleys. Protection only. Vincent's answer came without hesitation. Done, and if Keller comes at me. His silence changed. Sophie could almost feel the old violence waiting behind it. Then you call me before you do anything, she said. Promise me. I promise. The next morning, Sophie sat alone in the diner's corner booth with a yellow legal pad and the 60 pages spread beside her. She wrote until her wrist hurt. Bennett Hardware. 11 other businesses. 15 years of loans. Inspections. Lease traps. And quiet shame. She wrote like someone laying stones across a river in the dark. When Mr. Harris arrived, he read it twice. His weathered hands shook. Keller will know this is you. Sophie looked up. He already knows. That's why it has to be me. Mr. Harris swallowed. Your father would have been proud. The words landed hard. But this time they did not break her. They steadied her. By Friday evening, her post had been shared more than 100 times. By Sunday, the Buffalo News called. By Monday, 3 families contacted Reyes, each carrying the same old shame and the same sudden realization. They had not failed alone. Keller's lawyer sent a cease and desist before noon, full of polished threats and enough panic to smell through the paper. Sophie read it once, then called Reyes. Is this useful? Reyes almost laughed. More than useful. The letter was not just a warning. It was evidence of witness intimidation. For 15 years. Keller had known exactly where the legal line was. Now finally, he had stepped over it. Keller came back to the diner himself. No lawyer. No driver. Just his expensive coat. His cold smile. And the arrogance of a man who still believed every room had a price. Only Sophie, Mr. Harris, and 2 silent customers remained. Keller sat at the counter and pushed the cease and desist toward her. "You re-brave," he said. "That's usually what poor people call stupid before the bill comes due." Sophie felt her phone recording in her apron pocket. Ray is already listening on the open line. "My father asked someone to look at the papers," she said. Keller's smile faltered. "Your father was weak." Across the street, a black SUV rolled slowly into the lot. Vincent stepped out of the SUV. But he did not enter. He stood beneath the diner light with Tommy beside him, letting Keller see what he could have done and what he was choosing not to do. Keller looked through the window, then back at Sophie. His voice sharpened. "You have no idea what I can take from you." Sophie's fear rose, hot and real. But she kept her hands still. "You already took enough." Keller leaned close. "Then I'll take the rest." The words hung there, clear and ugly, in her pocket. Reyes heard every syllable. Sophie finally smiled, small and shaking. "Thank you, Mr. Keller," she said. "That was exactly what we needed." Keller's face changed before he could hide it. For the first time, Sophie saw fear in him, not much, but enough. He stood too fast, knocking his cup sideways, and coffee spread across the counter like a dark stain. Outside, Vincent did not move. That restraint was more frightening than any threat. Keller walked out past him, shoulders stiff, pretending he was still in control. Tommy watched him leave, then looked through the window at Sophie with a grim little nod. The phone rang before Sophie could breathe. Agent Reyes did not waste a word. "We moved." Sophie pressed her palm to the wall. The raids had started 3 hours earlier. Federal marshals hit Keller's 3 offices at the same time, before his lawyers could warn anyone. Servers, ledgers, contracts, phones, everything was seized. The victory was real, but Reyes' voice carried something darker. The files showed 11 more active schemes, including one in Niagara Falls. 40 to 60 families had been targeted over 15 years. 40 to 60 people had gone to sleep believing they had failed, never knowing their lives had been measured, priced, and taken apart on purpose. Sophie leaned against the wall until the hallway steadied. This had never been only her father's story. It had only started there for her. "Is it enough to hold him?" Sophie asked. "It is enough," Reyes said. And Sophie. The recording mattered. He finally said the quiet part out loud. After she hung up, Sophie stood still, counting the ticks of the kitchen clock until she could breathe normally. Then she walked back into the diner and saw Vincent waiting by the corner booth. Still careful, still giving her space. She sat across from him and told him everything. For once his mask failed him. Relief moved across his face, raw and unguarded, followed by something like grief. 11 more, he murmured. Sophie nodded. Some of them were still in time. Vincent looked down at his untouched coffee. "Your father should have had this." Sophie's throat tightened. He tried, he just didn't have the right pieces. Vincent shook his head. The pieces were there. Keller made sure nobody could hold them long enough. Sophie traced the rim of her cup. "Then we hold them now." Their eyes met, and the noise of the diner seemed to fall back. There was too much between them to name in the middle of a lunch rush. Fear, gratitude, anger, want, and something steadier than all of it. Vincent reached across the table, then stopped before touching her hand. Sophie smiled faintly. "Not yet, let me get through today first." By noon, the headlines were live. By mid-afternoon, a television reporter stood in the gravel lot, camera light cutting through the gray. Sophie stood on the diner step, hands cold, spine straight. She named her father. She named Bennett Hardware Supply. She explained how a good man had been broken by a machine designed to make him blame himself. She did not cry until the reporter asked if she had been afraid. Then Sophie looked into the camera and let the truth show. I was terrified every step of the way, she said, but I did it anyway. Back inside, the diner began to fill slowly. As if the town was learning how to come back. Frank Duca came first, taking his usual table with a quiet nod that said more than an apology. Then Mrs. Patterson. Then 2 truckers who had avoided the place all week. Late in the afternoon, Pete Hamill sat at the counter, staring at a slice of cherry pie as if it could forgive him. I let him scare me off, he said. Sophie poured his coffee. He scared everyone. Pete shook his head. Not you. Sophie looked toward the cracked window. Taped but still holding. Yes, she said softly, me too. At 5:15, Gerald Fitch stepped inside. He looked smaller now, the way people sometimes do after setting down a secret that had been holding them upright. He sat at the counter and wrapped both hands around a mug. His eyes filled before he spoke. I should have helped your father then. Sophie felt the old hurt stir, but it did not rule her. She leaned over the counter. You helped now. Gerald's mouth trembled. Daniel was such a gentle man. Even at the end, he wasn't angry. He just kept asking someone to look at the papers. Sophie closed her eyes for 1 second. Her father had fought. Someone had finally said it out loud. The next turn came at 6:15. Mr. Harris came out of the kitchen with the phone in his hand and no color in his face. For a terrible second, Sophie thought something had gone wrong. Then he said Briggs was pulling out of Keller's acquisition deal. The scandal had made the building toxic. Briggs wanted out fast and was offering to sell at assessed value. The diner went silent. Rosa stopped wiping the counter. Diane covered her mouth. Mr. Harris tried to smile, then failed. I don't have that kind of money, he whispered. Sophie looked toward the corner booth, where Vincent had once sat watching everything. I might know someone who does. When she called Vincent, the silence on his end was careful. Are you asking for an investment? He asked. A clean one, Sophie said. Standard terms. Written contract. No hidden favors. No pressure. No debt I can see. You want everything in daylight. Yes, she swallowed. Between the diner and you. Between us. If there is ever going to be an us. Vincent was quiet long enough that she heard her own heart. Then daylight it is, he said. Mr. Harris was crying before Sophie finished explaining. 31 years. He choked. Sophie looked around the diner. Battered and warm and alive. 32 next year. April came to Buffalo slowly, melting the last dirty ridges of snow along the roadside. Sophie sat beside her mother on the couch, tea cooling between them, the television flickering without anyone watching. Her mother had finally come home from the hospital. The house felt fragile, but it was no longer hollow. On the chair by the window lay the soft gray blanket Vincent had sent and never mentioned again. Sophie ran her fingers over its edge and smiled despite herself. For once, she let the quiet stay. Her mother held her hand the way she had when Sophie was little. Tell me about him, she said. Sophie looked down, embarrassed and not surprised. Mothers heard what daughters tried not to say. There's a man, she admitted. Dangerous. Complicated. Her mother squeezed her fingers. Those are not always different things. Is he good to you? Sophie thought of Vincent standing outside the diner instead of storming in, of his anger held on a leash, of the way he listened when truth hurt. He's honest when it matters, she said. He is too easy, but he's real. Her mother gave a tired smile. Real is better than easy. By Friday night, Sophie was alone at the diner, restocking napkin holders after closing. The building was quiet in the way only old places can be, full of every voice that had ever passed through. Then the bell over the door chimed. Vincent stood inside the doorway. Alone, no Tommy, no black sedan waiting outside. He had walked through the April wind, his coat dusted with cold, his hair less controlled than usual, without the guards and the careful distance. He looked less like a man people feared and more like a man who had carried too much for too long. We reclosed, Sophie said softly. I know. He took a faded photograph from his coat pocket and set it on the counter. 15 men stood outside the Maple Creek Cafe in a blur of snow and yellow light. Sophie recognized the night before she recognized the faces. In the back row stood Vincent, guarded and exhausted, his eyes colder than they were now. Who took this? Tommy, Vincent said. He keeps proof of things he can say. Sophie studied the men. They looked less like monsters than survivors caught in bad weather. Vincent rested his hands on the counter. When we left that night, I sat in my car for 10 minutes. I have walked away from worse things than hunger, but I couldn't leave that one behind. His voice dropped. You treated 15 men like they still counted. I didn't know how badly I needed to see that. It was stew, Sophie whispered. It was your last food after a double shift. It was an open door in a storm. It was kindness given to men who had forgotten how to receive it. Vincent's gaze stayed steady. That is never just stew. Sophie set the photograph down with care, her fingers trembling. It changed my life too. The diner light hummed softly above them. Outside, the road was empty. For the first time since Keller. There was no emergency waiting in the next room. Only Vincent, the counter between them, and all the words they had postponed. My life is complicated, he said. That's a generous word for it. Yes, he accepted the blow without looking away. I spent 20 years pretending control was the same thing as redemption. Then I met a woman who could barely afford to feed herself and still knew exactly who she wanted to be. Sophie felt her throat tighten. I didn't rescue you. No, he said. You made it impossible for me to keep lying to myself. She stepped around the counter, close enough to see the tiredness in his eyes. I know who you are. Vincent's and I'm still here. Her first instinct was to pull back. It had kept her safe for years, but safety had never felt like this. Frightening. Honest, alive. I'm not interested in being saved, she said. Vincent nodded. I know I want truth. Even when it's ugly. Especially then. You will have it. She took his hand. The surprise on his face vanished into something steadier. Almost reverent. Outside, April dusk stretched over the road. Inside, the Maple Creek Cafe held its warmth around them, a place that had survived storms. Predators, fear, and the cost of silence. Somehow, it had brought two lonely people to the same counter at the right time. Rosa found out Monday and told Diane before the morning rush ended. Mr. Harris said nothing, only smiled for 3 straight days. Tommy took another photograph and hid it for a year. Gerald Fitch slept through the night for the first time in 11 years. Sophie's mother slowly grew stronger. And that summer she sat in a booth, telling Mr. Harris that Daniel Bennett would have loved the place even more now. Richard Keller was indicted on 43 federal counts. His frozen assets began moving, slowly and imperfectly, toward the families he had ruined. The diner stayed open, not because it had been rescued, but because people had finally chosen to stand around it. And Sophie, 26 years old and tired in ways most people never saw, finally understood what her father had meant. Real kindness is never wasted. It travels farther than the person giving it can see. It reaches strangers, wakes buried courage, and returns in forms no one could plan. Protection, truth, justice. Love, sometimes it starts as one last pot of stew on a night when the roads are closed and the world feels frozen solid. Sometimes it becomes the thing that saves a diner, frees a dead man's name from shame, and gives 2 wounded people a future neither of them dared to imagine. That is mercy, given freely, finding its way home.